Hello, Sundula. Can you please introduce your book and tell us why it's called Home or Nang?
Hi, so my name is Tenzin Sundu. I'm a Tibetan writer and activist based here in Dharamshala. This is my fifth book of poems and stories. It's called Nang, Nowhere to Call Home. The idea of calling the book Nang is because a majority of the Tibetan population today live inside Tibet under Chinese occupation. So although they live in their homeland, there is no freedom there. And those of us who live in exile, who live in freedom, we have no home. So home is essential for both Tibetans inside and outside, and home is so essential for all of us. It's our yearning, it's the idea of freedom. So therefore I am talking about the idea of home in this book, which is my fifth collection of poems and stories.
So can you tell us what's special about this book and why should people buy or read it?
This book is an articulation of the unique Tibetan political situation where we are. So I am trying to articulate this very unique cultural, political, spiritual understanding with which we are leading not only a political freedom movement but also personally how we are having to talk about our own personal stories and our political ideology and the sense of belonging to home. So there are poems, there are stories. Stories which are both fiction and also non-fiction writings. There are some essays also. So for me, these are Tibetan articulation which can be said in this way. These are writings that I've done over the past 10 years. So over 10 years, the political changes that we have been able to see in our own life, these are the things that I've written. So I think it would make sense to any Tibetan who are reading English and who then, of course, we have to talk about our own struggles to other people in English. Perhaps this will make some sense to them.
And for the non-Tibetans, how should they read or perceive this book?
I think there are a lot of interest about Tibet, Buddhism, the idea of Tibetan language and culture. There are a lot of interest now growing, especially because China has become a problem to a number of countries. So they want to understand what China has done to China's occupied countries like Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, Hong Kong and Taiwan. So Tibet is an essential key in understanding China and what China is doing. So therefore, when you understand Tibet, the political situation, what the Tibetans are doing with their cultural resistance, it will make sense for a number of people from outside the Tibetan community to make sense of Tibet, the Tibetan religion and culture, and the Tibetan resistance. And this book tells the story of the Tibetan resistance movement in English, and it will make sense to them, and also it will give them an understanding of what the Tibetans are doing for their freedom from China.
Sundula, you are an activist as well as a writer. How do you manage between these two?
See, as an activist, I've been to jails, I've been to courts where I had to answer my political activism, and also I've led hundreds of protests. And as an activist, I've traveled to so many different places, mostly schools, universities, talk about Tibet. But for me, it is the writer that gives me a new idea, a new way of talking about it, and making sense of what is happening now, and giving it a unique articulation. So for me, the writer and the activist, they live together and they make great sense of what is happening now and how to articulate that in the most profound and beautiful manner.
Be it as an activist or a writer, what motivates you or what keeps you going?
For me, there is unquenchable thirst for the freedom of Tibet. And this idea of our country being free and independent tomorrow with His Holiness the Dalai Lama ruling Tibet, this is my dream. It has been my dream from childhood. So therefore, when I was in 5th standard, at the age of 11, I took a promise to myself. I said, when I grow up, when I finish my school, I'm going to work for the freedom of Tibet as a writer, as an activist, and that's what I'm doing today. So I'm very excited about what little thing I'm able to do with His Holiness the Dalai Lama as our leader, and my ultimate dream is to free Tibet and take His Holiness the Dalai Lama with us back to Tibet.
Many people look up to you, be it as an activist or a writer. Are you hopeful that you can return to Tibet or Nang in your lifetime?
I'm very hopeful. Hopeful not just because I'm Tibetan, not just because I'm patriotic, but things are changing. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama just this morning said there are changes happening in China, there are changes happening in Tibet, and also in the international community. Now we see United States is now having to contest against Chinese politics. So therefore, United States is now taking up a cause of Tibet. United States has started to talk about the human rights violations in East Turkestan. The case of genocide is being talked about by Canada. You see, there are a number of countries who are now troubled by China and China's trade and inhuman treatment China is meting out with their own people and also in China's occupied countries. So a number of these countries who are fighting against China want to support these freedom fighters in China and in China's occupied countries. Therefore, it is now inspired time. It's a really encouraging time for Tibetans to take up the issue of Tibet, which is now in the interest of India, which is in the interest of a number of other countries. So therefore, I'm very hopeful.
Tibet Write is a Tibetan writers group. We started way back in 2003 with the primary aim to cater to this gap in Tibetan narrative. You know, most outsiders know Tibet through Buddhism and meditation and lamas and monks and often, personally to me, wherever I go, people ask me, are you a Buddhist? You either say yes. Are you a practicing Buddhism? Are you a vegetarian? So these kinds of perception. So between perception and others' perception, how they see us and our reality, there's a huge gap. And that this gap has to be filled some way or the other. And one thing that we realize is to make sure that our narrative based on human experience is promoted. So this is why we started Tibet Rise in 2003, and the book that we are going to launch today is one of the titles that we have published recently.